Hello, everybody, and welcome to the sixth ReCap webinar. Today's webinar is entitled Capitalism Alone, the Future of the System That Rules the World. Our speaker is Professor Branko Milanovic from City University of New York. Branko is a senior scholar at the Stone Center on Socio-Economic Inequality. He served as lead economist in the World Bank's research department for almost 20 years, living to write his book on global income inequality, Worlds Apart. He was a senior associate at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington and has held teaching appointments at the University of Maryland and Johns Hopkins University. Branko's main work area is income inequality in individual countries and globally. He has published articles in various top economic journals, and his book received multiple awards and prizes. In 2018, he was awarded jointly with Mariana Mazzucato the 2018 Leontief Prize for Advancing the Frontiers of Economic Knowledge. His most recent book, Capitalism Alone, was published in September 2019. Branko today will tell us about the two currently competing types of capitalism: the liberal meritocratic capitalism developed in the West over the last 200 years, and the authoritarian political capitalism, which China and Russia best exemplify. These two types differ not only in the political, but also in their economic and social characteristics. The vital link between capitalism and liberal democracy is currently questioned by China's economic success and by the populist and plutocratic challenges to liberal democracy and globalization. Indeed, political capitalism is attractive also to Western elites because it grants greater autonomy to them. Moreover, liberal capitalism has been weakened by a 4-decade-long deepening of income and wealth inequality between successful elites and the stagnating rest. The working class in the US and other Western countries is currently vulnerable to authoritarianism, racism, and xenophobia more than ever. Today, Branko will tell us what is ahead of this competition and the crisis of liberal capitalism. Without further ado, Branko, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Claudio. It is, of course, a pleasure to be invited to your series, and it's a pleasure to see that there are lots of people who are interested in the topic. So I would, as you said, let me try to get my PowerPoint, which I think is fine now. First, again, thanks to everybody who has come. And as it is recorded, of course, it would be hopefully seen by even more people. I'm going to present a part of my book, Capitalism Alone, today, simply because there are too many topics to be presented at once, and I would really have otherwise to do a very, very superficial presentation of each of them, which really would not add to very much. So I prefer to present parts more thoroughly. And I've chosen for today to talk about the chapter 2, which is inequality and the forces of inequality in liberal meritocratic capitalism, as Claudio mentioned. Then I would mention a little bit the political capitalism of China and the genesis of political capitalism that you can read in chapter 3, which I think is an important chapter of the book. But then, as you can see here, there are also chapter 4 and 5. The chapter 4 deals with the interaction of capitalism and globalization in several areas. First, in labor movements, which basically is migration, and the effects of migration both on global poverty, global inequality, but also on political stability in the countries where migrants go to. Then the globalization and capital, which deals with supply chains, and that was, of course, written before the pandemic. Then globalization, capitalism, and the welfare state, the pressures on the welfare state coming from globalization, and corruption and globalization, which I think is a topic that has not been very much directly studied. And I think it's an important topic. And finally, in the future of global capitalism, I discussed the relationship between these two different political and liberal capitalisms, and also the invasion of commodification into our ordinary life, how many of the activities which used to be outside of the market have recently become marketized. So let me then start with the talk proper. First, I would define these two types of capitalism, and then I would talk about 6 systemic, and I insist on the term systemic inequalities in meritocratic and or liberal capitalism. I will also define the terms meritocratic and liberal. They're not the usual definitions, so you would see there is a little bit of a difference there. And then I will talk, if we have enough time, a little bit about the policy, but I'm not extremely specific on the policies. I think they're just basically done in a fairly abstract way, so that when you think of policies for each individual country, you do have quite a lot of latitude, I think, to decide what you think would be the best. In other words, I didn't want in the book to be too specific and to just sort of take either the American experience or West European experience to be really the only one that matters. So I would define, first let me start with the definition of what you might call the classical capitalism, which is present in, works like Ricardo and Marx, where you essentially have 2 or 3 classes. As you know, in Ricardo, you have landlords as well, but for simplicity, I would speak essentially of 2 classes, because I would also speak of the 2 incomes coming from capital and incomes coming from labor. Now, in Marx and in Ricardo and Marx, you have, as I said, a class of capitalists and you have class of workers. The important thing to realize is that in reality, they don't talk really about income distribution because it is subsumed under the functional or factorial income distribution. If you're a capitalist, you're by definition almost richer than a worker. So in this graph where income is on the horizontal axis and sort of notional number of people is on the vertical axis, as you can see, basically all the capitalists are richer than any worker. So all capitalists are richer than all workers. There is an income inequality among the capitalist class, which obviously would derive from the fact that there are capitalists who have more capital and wealth, and there are others who have less. There is also some income inequality among workers, which would derive from the fact that you have skilled workers or less skilled workers. In Marx's term, this is complex labor versus simple labor. But the 2 classes do not overlap. And secondly, each class receives only the income from its own factor of production. So you don't have capitalists who actually receive labor income, and you do not have workers who receive capital income. You will see that that particular distinction would disappear, or actually would become much less sharp. It would not disappear, but it would become much less sharp in modern capitalism. But in the classical, I think we can take it as having been very sharp. So then if you have that kind of a view of the world of 2 classes with very different types of incomes, you actually have the following sort of income distribution, again, extremely simplified. You would have now people ranked by their income level. Income level is on the vertical axis. People are ranked, as you can see, by total income on the horizontal axis. And then you start only with labor income at first. It is, for some of them, it's really minimal. It doesn't start from 0, obviously, but it starts a little bit above 0 because of, that would be subsistence income. And it rises gradually as you move towards more skilled labor. Then when you have exhausted everybody who has labor income, you start with capitalists. As you noticed, of course, capital income, of course, increases also because there is variability among capitalists, but I just for simplicity drew it here as exponential, kind of exponential curve, implying that that's where really the differentials in income become very significant. And this is something that we will still see today. As you know, when you look at income distributions, empirical income distributions today, you see at the very top an increase, which is very substantial always. There is, that's why actually Pareto's rules apply only to the top income distribution, because you essentially have a power law or an exponential distribution at the top. But you do not have that kind of distribution in the middle or let's suppose around the median. So what I drew here is very stylized, but it's not sort of unrealistic for the income distribution under classical capitalism. Now, let's now look how the income distribution looks in what I call meritocratic capitalism or liberal. Before I say more about that, let me define the terms. The terms in the book are not defined like that in a sort of usual way. They both come from John Rawls's definition of different types of inequalities. Meritocratic equality in Rawls is simply equality before the law. So in other words, there is no classes of people who have different legal rights. So you don't have, for example, nobility or clergy that, as you know, in the feudal system had different rights. You don't have a caste system where also different castes but legally almost have different rights. Or you do not have, to give another example, the Ottoman milieu system where different religions had different rights. So here, in a meritocratic capitalism, you basically have, in sort of legal terms, everybody has the same legal rights. But that's the next liberal equality comes. Liberal equality means sort of an additional requirement, which is that you adjust for two types of advantages that the rich people and their offspring receive. And these two types of advantages are first, taxation of inheritance, so that you reduce the advantage that somebody has from the fact of being born with, with rich parents. And the second one, you introduce public education, which is free, so that the advantage that would occur to people from being able to pay for private education is also diminished. So this is actually the liberal capitalism has in the book that particular meaning. The meaning that there are two adjustments which are made, and these are taxation of inheritance, or you can even say taxation of wealth, and free and very good public education. In the meritocratic capitalism, as I said, there are no such adjustment. It's essentially, basically, there is no role of the state in the sense that it does exist in liberal capitalism. So how would the distribution look in meritocratic capitalism? So here you see actually labor income. Of course, I just drew it the same way as it was in classical capitalism, but capital income now is a little bit different. You notice that, of course, like 30 to 40% of the population has almost no capital income, but then capital income starts appearing. And then at the very top, as you notice, you have the richest people who actually have, of course, still more income from capital than from labor, but these two sources of income become available to the rich people, to the very people on the top, so that really the top of the income distribution is not now only composed of people who have entirely their income from capital, but it's composed of people who have very high capital incomes and very high labor incomes. I would call that later by creating a new term of homoploutia, which I used from, obviously, like whenever you have to create a new term, you go back to Greek, words. Homo is the same, obviously, and plutia, wealth, meaning that they would have wealth both from their so-called human capital and from financial capital. And that would really be something, as you will see in a moment, which is really concentrated at the top of the income distribution. Now you can then think of the third type of capitalism that is more sort of, how should I say, capitalism possibly of the future, where you would have labor and capital income present throughout income distribution. So that would not do away with income inequality, but it would actually eliminate inequality in composition of incomes. In other words, if you're a poor person and have $10 of labor and $10 of capital income, you would have half and half. You would still have half of your income from labor, half of that from capital. And then there is another person who might have 100 units of labor income and 100 units of capital income. I mean, consequently, the gap between you and him or her would be significant, 10-1, but the compositional inequality would be 0 because the composition of income between labor and capital is the same for that rich person, 100 versus 100, which is 50% of total income from labor, 50% from capital, and it would be the same for you. So this is, I think, an interesting introduction. I worked more recently after the book with Marco Rinaldi on that. It is an interesting introduction because you have now to look at income distribution in two in two different ways, in two different realms, if you will. One of that is the typical income inequality, and another one is inequality in composition of your incomes. So inequality in the shares of labor and capital. So maybe some questions will be asked about that later, but let me then go to the 6 systemic inequalities in this liberal or meritocratic capitalism. I'm not going to read them out because obviously you can see it on the slides, but some of them are quite well sort of studied empirically. And I think it's important to put them all together to realize how the current system essentially is geared toward the production of higher inequality. And then if nothing is actually done on the policy side, how that production might continue. And of course, the relationship between the sort of increased inequality and globalization that I'll also mention at the end. So the first fact is, which is I think quite well known, is that there was an increase in the capital share in the last 30 to 40 years in all rich countries and even in emerging economies or countries that are sort of at a medium level of income like China. Why is it important? It's important for many reasons. First, if capital share increases and of course consequently labor share goes down, the relative power of capitalists certainly rises compared to labor. Or you can even say that maybe the causality went the other way, from the weakening of the relative power of labor through reduction in power of trade unions, through globalization, which opened the global market and introduced millions of new workers, especially with the end of communism in former Soviet Union and Eastern European countries, and the introduction of China and India into world global system, you had a change in the factor shares. In other words, the number of people who were part of capitalist system increased tremendously. And the amount of capital probably did not increase as much. So in other words, the capital labor ratio under the capitalist system probably declined. And that meant that the power of capital over labor increased. There may be other elements with globalization that the power of capital increased because of ability of capital to move, whereas labor, at least until now, has been much less able to move. In any case, the increase in capital share is, as I said, well documented. And the problem from the income distribution side is precisely that if you have an increase in a source of income, which is generally received by the rich, you have a quasi-automatic increase in inequality. If you go back to the first graph under, and the second graph, the first graph under the classical capitalism and the second graph under the liberal capitalism, you notice that in both of these graphs, the share of capital income among the top is greater than share of labor income among the top. In the classical capitalism, the share of labor income is 0 at the top. In liberal capitalism, the share of labor income is, I suppose, 20 or 30%. So when then the overall macro capital share goes up, obviously the incomes of the people at the top increase faster than the incomes of the people elsewhere. And that, of course, is a quasi-automatic transmission to higher inequality. So this is why the increase in the capital share is a problem. It is a problem for income inequality or income distribution because of that quasi-automatic spill into the higher interpersonal inequality. Now, why does it happen? It happens, as I was saying, because capital income is much more concentrated. It's much more concentrated among the top. And here, if you take the Gini coefficients of capital income, and I think this is the area that has not been sufficiently explored, because labor income inequality has been studied and studied, but inequality of capital income has, for many reasons, been studied much less. So let me show you here historical data for like several countries, and basically I'm using this data from Luxembourg income study. You can basically do the same calculation. I've done it actually for probably 20 countries or more, and the results are always the same. The Gini of capital income is much more concentrated with the Gini coefficient of 0.9 approximately, and labor income much less. And even in countries like UK that you can see on the slide, where you had under the Thatcher years, very strong increase in inequality of labor income, that came to 0.6. This is all before taxation. So this is market income. And you notice a really significant gap between Gini for labor and Gini for capital. And then if you have an increase in capital share, the more unequal source of income increases in its importance. And of course, overall inequality goes up. And as I said, this is kind of a rule for every country. Now, you can actually, and that's the work that I did with Marco Rinaldi recently, you can notice that there are differences, however, between different types of countries, not the difference that the capital would not be always more unequal, but there will be differences in the gap. And that could actually tell you a little bit about the different types of systems or the distribution of assets within different countries. Then there is another element which I think is quite important. This is a confusing graph by Ed Wolf, but I like Ed Wolf's book, and I think it's a kind of an encyclopedia of wealth inequality in the United States in the last century. And what it actually shows is that the composition of assets between the middle class, the poor, the middle class, and the rich is very different. It's really, the rich basically have financial instruments as assets. And only, as you can see, only 12% of the assets of the middle class in the United States are financial instruments. Most of the assets that the middle class has in the US is housing. In some European countries like Germany, where lots of housing is being rented, so you have tenants, even that asset is not very much present among the middle class. Well, then what does this concentration of assets, financial assets in the hands of the rich mean? It means that essentially the rich own the states, the countries where they live in terms of financial assets. In other words, if you look at this graph, which shows you the percentage of all stock owned by the 10% of the richest wealth holders in the United States, you notice here that about 90%, between 85, depending whether you include also the pension funds, as you can see, the blue line includes them, they own about 85% of all financial assets in the United States. Or if you exclude this and look only at the mutual funds and stocks, they own 93% of all assets. So the top decile basically owns the United States. And this is not, again, very different between the countries. You have this incredible concentration of financial wealth only among a relatively small group, well, 1/10 of the population. So that then leads to the following problem, is that the returns for these different asset classes are not the same. If the stock market essentially outperforms housing, then the very rich go even further ahead from the middle class. But on top of that, they can go even further ahead because the returns within each asset class are not the same. So this is something which I think is intuitively obvious. Again, it has not been studied until recently. This is from the work by Eric Zweig here. Is that if you have 1,000 euros or dollars and show up at with the bank, you would actually get the usual instrument. You would put that on the savings account, and nowadays you would receive 0 interest or maybe 1%. But if you show up with 10 million or 100 million, you would, of course, get much better advice. You would get wealth managers, and you would actually have a higher rate of return, even adjusting for the risk. So that what happens then is a further sort of force that sort of favors the rich, is that their composition of their assets is different. And on top of that, the return within each asset class are higher for them than for the people who have less assets. And that, I think, is one of the factors, as I call the systemic factors, that lead to the increase of inequality. Then finally, I come to the third systemic factor, which I called, as I said before, homoploutia, is that more and more we find that the people at the very top of the income distribution are themselves also in the top of income distribution by capital income and in the top of income distribution by labor. Now, this is the graph for the United States that shows you what percentage of people in the top decile are both in the top decile by capital and labor. Now, let's go back to the classical capitalism that I mentioned at the beginning. Under the classical capitalism, all the rich people are only capitalists. So this graph would tell you the number there would be 0. Why would it be 0? Because no person from that top class, which all depend on capital income, would also have a very high labor income. You would not have, JP Morgan working as a CEO of a different company. He would be basically having all his income from his own company, and it would be all capital income. Now, that is in the process of changing. As you notice here in the US, almost 30% of the people at the very top are also in the top capital and top labor distribution. Why does it happen? Because these are same individuals, as you can see, because many people, excuse me, either have very high labor incomes over a certain part of their life, which enables them to then save that money and then invest and become really capitalists as well. Or many of them might actually, and we don't really know because we don't have longitudinal data, many of them might inherit the money from their family and then also get very good education, fancy education, get good jobs, and very high salaries. So as I said, we don't know because we lack longitudinal data, but we do observe the fact of that coincidence between the correspondence rather between high labor and high capital incomes. If you do the same calculation for different countries, you notice actually that these percentages are very high in more advanced countries, Italy actually being here the highest with 27%, the United States 25%. Here it was around 2015, the year when it was done. And you do notice here at the bottom, the countries that are more of classical capitalist nature, like Mexico and Brazil, where you have that share, which is much lower. They are closer to classical capitalism simply in the sense that rich owners, rich capitalists in those countries are not very likely to work as sort of workers, even if that may not be, it may be skilled workers, but they still do not do that often. Unlike in rich countries where we see homoploutia being much more present. So then the question becomes, and I will be very brief on this, how much of US inequality is due to homoploutia and what are the drivers of homoploutia? As I mentioned before, we really can rather guess what are the drivers. We don't follow individuals sufficiently over their lifetime to be able to really pin down the reasons. And homoploutia, as I said before, does help us classify and understand various capitalisms, depending, as you have seen on that last slide, depending on whether they are very homoploutic, if you will, or not. And then finally, does homoploutia make social mobility less? Which I think is an important topic, because if you do have, I will conclude with that actually at the end, if you do have homoploutic society, that means that the people at the top first are quite invulnerable to changes either on the capital side or labor side, because if there is a decline, I suppose, in capital incomes, they still have very strong skills and high labor income. If there is a problem on the labor market, they can actually sort of use their financial assets to actually tide them over. Or the combination of these two things make them, as I said, invulnerable and more likely to transfer these advantages across generations. Or differently, you can say maybe it's a dramatic improvement because we don't have the class structure which is as rigid as under classical capitalism. So this is a nice graph that they did in the work with Jonathan Berman, where you see also Homoploutia in the US from 1960 to 2020 with different data sources, DINA, Distribution National Accounts, Survey of Consumer Finance, and Luxembourg Income Study. They all, although they are a little bit different as sources, they all show the increase of inequality of homoploutia in the US. So there is rising homoploutia, which we have seen already on the previous slide. And you also here see the second side, the other side of homoploutia is that the capital-rich people are no longer labor income poor. In other words, capital-rich people are now also labor income rich. So you don't have what we talked about in the classical capitalism, where capital-rich people were labor income poor. In other words, Ricardian landlords or Ricardian capitalists or Marxist capitalists were not workers. So they actually had one source of income. So I will skip this nomenclature of capitalism, because it gets us too complicated, and move to the next systemic feature of liberal or meritocratic capitalism, which has also been studied, but not put in a context in where I'm putting it. It's homogamy or assortative mating. Now, the assortative mating, as you know, means that people of similar education level and, more importantly, of similar income level tend to partner. So this graph here from a paper by Nish and Tjonsen, who was actually my student, I have to sort of praise my students, did this work with the US microdata. And this shows you the percentage of a cohort of young American males of the age between 20 and 35 and young American females of the same age from the top and the bottom deciles by labor income who marry each other. So the orange line is the assumption here. These are actually looking from the male, from the male side, is what is the likelihood of that young, rich American male of the cohort between 20 years and 35 years of age in 1970 marrying a woman from the same or the bottom, from the top or the bottom. Now, if you look here, the orange line tells you that this gives you the percentage of intermarriage, in the sense rich marrying the rich. The blue line shows you the percentage of the rich males marrying poor in labor incomes women, females. So you notice that in the beginning, these two dots are practically the same. So the likelihood was about the same. So if I'm like a rich man, I'm as likely to marry a poor woman as a rich woman. Notice that this is only here, we are actually taking out women who are, or men who are not in the labor force. So we don't want to mix things up by introducing people who are not in the labor force. So these are all people who are in the labor force and having labor incomes. What you notice then in the more recent period is that the percentage of men who marry rich women is now 3 times as high as the percentage of rich men who marry poor women. So what has happened is that essentially you're having now a much more frequent marriage of like with like. And the same thing can be sort of recalculated from the point of view of women. So the women also who were in the top decile, rich women, tended in the beginning of the period to marry equally or to partner equally, with men who are either rich or poor. But at the end of this period, the likelihood, the ratio of the likelihood of marrying a rich man versus marrying a poor man was 5 to 1. So again, we see it from both sides, which is obviously how it works out, that the homogamy or the likelihood of intramarriage of the rich is greater. Now, the intramarriage of the rich, among the rich, is not a bad thing per se, because you can actually say that the underlying factor which leads to that is greater participation of women in labor force and greater freedom of both men and women to choose the partners with whom they share things and whom they like or whom they may love with or whatever. But the downside of that from the point of view of income inequality is that you simply have greater inequality arithmetically if two people who are rich partner than if the rich person partners with somebody who is poor. It's just pure arithmetic. So you have there an issue. You have something which is socially desirable in the sense that it gives greater freedom to individuals to choose their partners, with the fact that that socially desirable feature leads arithmetically, as I said, to greater inequality. And I think these are the issues that we have to take into account, because inequality oftentimes indeed comes from something which you might call bad, quote unquote, comes from inequality in parental wealth, comes from monopoly, comes very often from stealing, plunder. But there are cases where inequality, higher inequality, comes from socially sort of desirable changes, as the one that I just mentioned in the case of freedom to choose your partner. And then finally, I will conclude this with the political science work, complicated graphs, so I will not explain all the details here, but the basic story is that you have the people who are actually favoring a certain policy change. And what you notice here is that upward sloping line shows you that that if the policy change is favored by the rich, by the 90th percentile of the income distribution, it is more likely to be actually debated and sort of politically sort of studied by the legislative bodies. In the case of the United States, is the Congress. I've seen the similar work for Germany, obviously, it's Bundestag. So in other words, if something matters to the rich, that comes to the agenda. If something matters to the 50th percentile, you see this flat line, meaning it doesn't matter what share of those who are in the middle of the income distribution cares about such policy change, the predicted probability of change is about the same. So in other words, whatever matters to the middle class or the poor, whether something matters to them more than something else, it really would not affect the political decision making in the political process. And that essentially tells you then that the political system is much more responsive to the needs of the rich than of the poor. So we then wrap all of this up by essentially the ability of the rich to, on top of the control of the political process, control also the educational process, which of course gives you then the ability to have higher labor income, higher wage. And this is the sort of striking numbers of college attendance by parental income level, as you noticed actually for the top 1%, it's practically everybody is in college attendance, but for the people who are, let's say, at the median income level, not even lower income level, you have only 60% of children who are at the attendance of college. And then that also, the high returns to college, to university education, go together with lower intergenerational mobility, or what is the same, higher intergenerational income correlation. In other words, correlation of incomes between parental income and children's income. So you have then the outcome is that not only, and I will stop here because I'm already at the end of my time, not only do you have the shrinking middle class in terms of market and disposable income, which this is the slide which shows you the decline in the income share of the 4 middle deciles in several advanced economies. But what I find more important is you have the creation of an elite, and that's this homoploutic and assortative mating elite that is able first to convert these advantages or to convey these advantages across generation to their children. And then, of course, through a very high cost of private education, which I think essentially is a monopoly over the private education maintained by the rich because of such excessive cost of private education. Only the rich are then able to send the children to such, expensive schools. On top of that, they control the political process, as we have seen, by the ability to have the parliaments enact policy decisions which are in their favor. And thereby they are creating not only a plutocracy, but they are creating also an ability to transfer that wealth across generations. So I think what we are now beginning, to witness, the danger that we're beginning to witness is precisely the creation of an elite that would be very strong in educational level, in labor incomes, wages, in capital incomes, and that would reduce the intergenerational mobility through the control of the political process among others. So this, I think, is this plutocratic danger that I think actually Claudio mentioned and alluded to in the introduction. And that, of course, danger in different forms does exist also in political capitalism. Now, I would like to finish on a note which is not entirely pessimistic. I think that there are certain forces, political forces, that work also to check that. And I think that we are now, at the end of this very long period of 40 years from Reagan to today, where the sort of political feeling or the political parties are beginning to address these issues that we have talked about. So I'm not sure that much has been done between, I know that not much has been done between the financial crisis and today, but I think that during the COVID and particularly after the COVID, I believe that we will have the beginning of some such processes. The two most important changes are the ones that I mentioned in the very beginning, and this is taxation of wealth and inheritance. And the second one is the change in the relative positions of public and private education. Finally, I would add to that much more widespread financial wealth for the middle class, which can come from worker ownership or from special tax advantages that would be given to the middle income people in order to have assets, which of course very often they didn't want to have because of high riskiness of those assets, and getting rid of the numerous loopholes that the rich have been able to use to accumulate wealth and not pay taxes, including, which I think is a good move forward, including the imposition of the minimum global tax of 15%, corporate tax of 15% across the world. So let me end there. There are lots of, questions, and I will be also happy to answer some questions about political capitalism. But as I said, this was quite a sort of a long presentation, and I had to choose whether I want to present one chapter of the book or the other. And I thought that this one probably, maybe for the audience that was here today, might have been more interesting. So thank you very much. And I will now sort of close my slides, and hopefully we would have more greater chance to discuss it.